Don't worry.
Thank you very much.
Here we are. Thank you.
The other one, it was basically a scam to sell a children's book. And so she supposedly wrote a children's book. She sold 10,000 copies to political allies who bought them and kept them in the warehouse because they had no need to buy them. So they were basically just funneling money to it. And it's not religion. The nightmares were that's okay. Nobody can fix us line. It's a crazy place.
Yeah. Yes, that's the question.
We're gonna have Clare on the screen here, right? Is that the plan?
Yeah.
Well, you're eating it very much.
It was very fun. Yeah,
Yeah.
No worries.
Yes.
Can we leave it open without an alarm? For a while, and then we should say,
No, that's so that it's pretty
Shall I open one of the windows?
oh, it's okay. Yeah. This is a better solution.
I thought about that, but I didn't say something. When I said that
Idea.
in the first 6 months,
This is the best idea. For some fresh air.
I don't know whether it's a defense relation. Grew in power after that, and then it continues whether they discover its levels of corruption are just there's there were basically this group of police who were completely criminal gangs, and they made millions basically going around holding up the drug dealers. I mean, they were all they were the police.
Yeah, I didn't want to capture the
Claire, can you hear us?
Still waiting on the last few.
Circle of 100 meters, 60 murders, levels of poverty are like. I told them to tell people to do 10,000. You could just house shopping in Baltimore, and I can show you 50 houses.
I think so.
Some of them are actually
Yeah.
There's 24,000 houses that are empty.
just to see what the sound is like. Is it any better than it was? Change the sessions.
Okay. Claire, could you give us a mic check?
Okay. Can you hear me?
That's helpful data because we cannot hear you.
Is Claire on? Is your mic on, Claire?
Yes.
Just turn it on. So why not? Yeah. No, at the bottom is there a cross next to the sound?
Sorry, could you try again, Claire?
Okay. Was the sound bad this morning then?
It was, yeah.
Yeah. And alas, it is now too.
Yeah. It still is. I don't know. There's the settings somewhere else, but I don't know where they are. Because I think we've got the computer sound on as opposed to the.
Could you try again for us, Claire?
Yep. I'm starting to try and think of what I can say. I might find a speech to read out.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And I thought maybe it's. You know,
Oh, good luck.
I know.
Do you know which one? It was on the one on the bottom initially, but that didn't work.
Okay.
And then we put the top one on, but that's not working
Is that
either.
good stuff? And I hope it works.
I'm safe.
Sorry, standing challenge.
Sorry, one more time, Claire.
Okay, I'm considering reading some extracts from a Sard novel.
Can you hear where that's coming out? Is it coming out of a? I can't quite. It's like it's coming from nowhere. I can't tell. I mean, we could do with some. Sorry, that was me trying to see if my volume was any louder. But I don't know where it's picking up the sound from, if I've just turned that one off. No, that's definitely not going to work. Okay.
Liam, we must have to start, so we've got George coming up and he may be able to reset it when he comes up.
Okay. Do we need the?
We need the mic to pick up any sound from in the room when we're asking questions.
Okay. Okay. And I'm going to start recording as well.
Start recording, yeah. I think the record might be on, but just check. Yeah. Claire, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. You sound very quiet.
Your voice is a bit tinny for us, but we're getting George to come up, but you'll have to start, and if you could speak as loudly as possible.
Okay,
Sorry.
I'm so sorry. That sounds really painful for you. Okay. Are you sure you want to proceed? We could pause and not do my presentation if you prefer, if that because it's not essential.
No, we should go ahead. People
I think
have been
so.
waiting to hear what you've got to say.
Yeah.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Okay. Is Alan's here, isn't he? Hello, Alan. It's nice to see you. Oh yeah, I can see your knees. Nice to see you. I'm so sorry that today's being a bit chaotic for me because it means I'm not going to be able to stay for your talk. I'm really pleased it's being recorded because hopefully I can kind of catch up with that later. But I'm also really sorry that I'm missing you in Brighton. So 100 apologies, Alan. Has Oliver had to go? Is Oliver still here?
Airport strikes, so you had to go early.
Okay, I just wanted to check in case I reference him in my paper or not. Like, I want to know if it's really awkward when you can't see people. I don't know whether, you're talking to someone or about someone in their absence. So, okay, thank you. That's really useful. Well, with no further ado then, I've got a few comments today. What I've tried to do is pick up on, let's be honest, some work I was doing on some other stuff and see how that might be applied to thinking the political. And I wanted to address the issue of the political because I know that's what the project is, and I appreciate we all have different ways in to that today, and people involved in the project more widely will have different ways into how they understand the political. And I think we've already mentioned that a couple of times today already. And in many ways, my approach is structured by and in conversation with Oliver's work. Sorry, I can see people moving. Thing is, I'm trying to talk loudly, but I'm also aware that I'm in a room on my own shouting at a computer, and it feels all wrong. It feels like, you know, when you're on a phone call to people far away and you start shouting. So I do apologize. Please do give me actual feedback, not noise feedback, if I'm getting this wrong in any way, if it's deafening or horrible or still too quiet. Okay, and we'll go along as work it out as we go along. Okay, so my way into this then, as I say, probably sits more closely to Oliver's than perhaps some of the other papers today, and is structured a little bit by the kind of work that Oliver has done already on the idea of the political in post-foundationalism, because that's also the area I draw on. But in particular, my way into this topic today is drawing on a thinker who sits awkwardly within that post-foundationalist school because he uses a different terminology, and that of course is Jacques Rancière, because I've had to default back to old work that I was doing in order to come up with something that I think is hopefully useful today. So I want to make an argument that this turn to the political, and this isn't necessarily just about, you know, what's going on in this project with literature, but it's something I want to raise as a question, really. I'm not sure I'm right. It's just something I'm pondering at the moment. I want to raise the question whether the turn to the political, with its accompanied compartmentalization of the political and politics as either separate or related, but somehow distinguishable, despite the advantages it offers in some ways theoretically, has not actually been so helpful for political theory. So I'm not saying that in itself it was a wrong turn and it was bad. I'm just saying that it's perhaps mistakenly taken us on a path that's led us to neglect some key parts of political thought, and that this needs to be remedied as we continue on the path of thinking the political. And in the presentation, I want to demonstrate this by using the work of Jacques Rancière as a sort of lens in order to, I think, get us out of a certain impasse about where we're going with either this terminology, how we understand the political, how we understand it as either a kind of something that brings us together or is divisive, to take that Arendtian or the Schmittian approach, or other ways of theorizing, kind of dominant ways of theorizing the political, and maybe to kind of move beyond some of these debates, learn from them and move beyond. So just to start by summarizing Rancière's really irritating terminology here, that makes it very difficult to talk about him in this regard, even though I think he's useful. Rancière's terminology actually changes around some of the words we're used to if we're used to other post-foundationalist thinkers. And I hope this is familiar to most of you, but I'm aware it may not be familiar to everyone, so I have to say it. So the distinction most post-foundationalist thinkers work with is the distinction between politics and the political. The political being that kind of bigger realm of how we change and transform and interact with each other politically, and politics being the more day-to-day ordered, structured stuff of government, power, force, authority and policy. However, Rancière does it the other way around in some ways. The word that many of us use as the political in other post-foundationalist thought, he refers to as politics. And when he's referring to what most of us might call politics in other forms, he calls that police. And in a way, we could say this is kind of useful because it helps us to focus on the domination that's at the heart of what he calls the police order and what other people refer to as politics. Sorry, I can see her man running about in the room. Is it okay?
Yes, I'm really sorry, Claire. I think it's much better here now.
Okay, that's really great.
Cheers. I'm sorry about the interruption.
No, it's not a problem. I'm really happy. I just wanted to check I wasn't just talking into a void.
No.
You can talk normally now, Claire,
yes.
without shouting.
Okay, it's good because I only just got my voice back from that last cold. Okay, so hopefully some of that made sense, that Rancière has basically turned these two terms around on their head, but he's talking about the same thing. So from now on, I'm probably going to try and talk about it as politics and police until I come back to the end and wrap up. So for Rancière, politics then refers to how and I'm doing this loosely to draw the links with the wider tradition of the political, how we associate together and intervene in the world to differentiate ourselves from that everyday world of order and authority. How we can, I might say, interrupt the domination of our world. The caveat for Rancière that makes him stand out and depart from some of these other thinkers is that for him, politics must operate and does operate around the linchpin of equality. And it's not an ontological status. Rather, it is a logical operation. This perhaps makes it a little bit more specific, and maybe it might appear, I don't think it is, but appear more restricted than some other understandings of the political. But it is still in Rancière's formulation how we can operate on the ordered structures of our polity. And crudely put, I think it's useful to think about politics for Rancière as how we can affect change. And therefore police as kind of what goes on every day, all the ordinary norms, the habits, the repetition of political order. So this I've said already, Rancière refers to as police. And perhaps I think his redefinition then of these two terms is useful. Perhaps there is a use here, and I think this is his intention, that calling the everyday ordering police is helpful because it underlines how that everyday almost tradition or repetition of behaviours can entrap us, can hold us captive, as Wittgenstein might say. And this helps remind us not to fall prey to habit, to be alert to our customs and question our institutions. However, as many others have noticed and many have critiqued Rancière for, it also cannot be helpful. It can be read as kind of absurdly rebellious, saying everything that is our ordinary day-to-day stuff is policing, because there's this negative connotation that we all feel with the word policing, even if Rancière says, oh, it doesn't need to be there. This kind of, we need to rebel against all these orders just for the sake of it. It almost makes out that all of these orders are bad and negative just because they're practices, just because they're institutionalized. And now that is not what Rancière is arguing, but I think quite often that is how he is read. And perhaps then we have two problems. Rancière wanted to respond to this argument about the political because he had an issue with a slightly facile reading of Foucault. The reading that was wrongly extrapolated from Foucault that just said, oh, everything's political. And in a way that enabled people to say, well, we don't need to really act because everything's political already. We don't need to make it political. And that's what I'm calling the facile reading of Foucault that Rancière is responding against. And Rancière says, OK, so let's call it let's call it police to show that nothing happens unless we then force it. Politics needs to be done. We need to act. However, we can then go back to this more facile reading of Rancière and say, oh, OK, but that then means that we end up with a heroic or eventual or rare moment of politics. And Rancière himself calls it rare. But sometimes I think this is overread. I think the claim that it is currently rare doesn't mean it has to be rare, that ontologically it is rare. It's just an observation of the world today that it's rare. But if we overread this in the same way Rancière has a problem with people overreading Foucault, we end up with an issue that politics is something that is rare, is eventual, is this hero moment. And the rest of the time, we just have to kind of exist in this mire of domination. OK, so then I want to point out that if we can hold out against this reading of Rancière, we can note that Rancière very clearly does call for attention, not just to politics, and this is what he's always accused of, just focusing on politics. But he also draws very clear attention, I think, to the differentiation between police orders, different types of police order. He notes that politics can only ever happen within the police. It operates on the police. It's not a separate sphere. And he constantly underlines then just how important that configuration of the police order is for how politics can happen. And he often refers to the police order in this way as something called the order of the sensible, what we consider to be normal. It's very similar to kind of Judith Butler's idea in this way of normative order, the sensible, ordinary, common sense. Now, I think his argument then that what happens in a moment of politics does relate to and will happen differently depending on the type of police order it operates within, has really wide implications that go beyond his work, and I will argue at the end of this feed back into the wider categorization of the political sphere, that division between politics and the political. And I think that we can see this in Rancière's work if we have a look very briefly, and I hope I can keep this brief, at his recent interventions, or not so recent, I'm talking about the last decade, into the populism debate. Although at first glance, perhaps when you hear them, they might help underline to you why he's so often misunderstood or dismissed. So recently, Rancière has made what appears to sometimes be a startling claim that the people do not exist. And before that, he was sometimes quoted for stating that democracy is not, to begin with, a form of state. Rancière's polemical language in both of these cases attempts to trigger a conceptual break with our ordinary assumptions, and at the same time a break with the foolish, simplistic reading of populism as the leading ill of politics today, which I've argued elsewhere equates populism too easily with a form of authoritarianism and recasts the usual understanding of the main political cleavage of left and right with one where we have liberal democracy on one side and populism on the other. And populism just refers to anyone who's not a neoliberal centrist, and it's a good way of getting rid of the opposition and stopping us from talking about left-right politics. So by attacking the central terms of this argument on populism, the foolish argument on populism, with his slogan-like polemical statements, Rancière hopes to force us to hesitate before we weigh in on the populism debate and its misleading discussions concerning which people are really the people. Such a break forces us to acknowledge that all the people, those who form the sovereign body in a democracy and those who challenge it, can never be fully present to themselves in a simple sense of all being in the same place at the same time. Now, given Rancière's strident defence of democracy, this isn't a problem for him. Instead, it's just an understanding of how democracy operates and how equality operates and how politics operates within democracy. For Rancière, democratic politics occurs when an individual group that can only ever be, in reality, a subset of the people, seek to enact the whole people in various ways. The purpose of such a demonstration is to manifest their equality to the rest of the people, demonstrating there's no sensible reason to treat them differently. This means that democratic politics operates by asserting a competing definition of the people against the dominant status quo definition, such that two competing definitions operate at the same time, impossibly, we might say, from a logical point of view. And it's this impossible operation, which is both an improbable inaction of equality and a never reachable future horizon, that enables the emergent staging of the people to rupture the prevailing definition of the people, to show that this prevailing view is no longer viable, regardless of whether people try and tuck it back on. We've heard an alternative, something else now exists. And this creates an opening for the existing configuration of politics to change, to include those somehow who are challenging it. And so, how does this group of people become the people? Well, in technical terms, Rancière indicates they never do. And that's why they never exist. They simply act as if they are the people. In each of Rancière's examples, people experience a moment of disjuncture when they realise there is no good reason why they are unequal in their current order. It's not that there's a good reason to be equal, it's that there's no good reason to be unequal. This prompts a staging of equality, which could be said to be effective democratically, if it succeeds in demonstrating that those enacting it are the people. But this is not necessarily their intention. Their intention is to demonstrate there's no good reason why they should be treated differently or allotted a less equal place than the rest. If their demonstration somehow attaches into and affects the common sense view, then they have managed to demonstrate they're no different from the rest, from everybody else, from the people. This type of democracy could involve an assembly of people, but it could be staged by just one person or a small group of people. It need not involve a big crowd, an assembly, and a gathering of people or an assembly may not be particularly democratic in this egalitarian sense. It really changes, and I think more so than a lot of people give him credit for, it really challenges the way we're understanding and conceptualizing the aesthetic of democratic politics, what it looks like, what it sounds like. It's only because democratic politics stages the people against dominant assertions of the people, because two competing definitions can and must operate at the same time, impossibly from a logical point of view, but entirely necessary from a democratic perspective, that it's able to enact politics and create an opening from which we can transform our world. Thus, the people are never a problem for democracy, and we should be very cautious of people who tell us they are, or that certain people are a problem for democracy just because they are people. The people are democracy. If the people are seen to be a problem for democracy due to the convoluted knots the populism debate ties us in, then I've suggested elsewhere it indicates the problem lies more in our understanding of how liberal democracy works and what populism is, rather than with the people. Now, seeing how Rancière's conception of the people can only operate if it is playing with the dominant assertions enshrined in the so-called democratic state, we can see that it's therefore a given for Rancière that democracy is a form of state. But it's not, as he says, at first, a form of state. It is both a form of state and a form of popular action at one and the same time. And neither can exist without the other. Rather than getting institutions off the hook for not being democratic, which of course, if democracy is not a form of state, wouldn't matter, it makes us see that oligarchic institutions are here, but they are a problem for us today and need to be opposed and replaced with democratic alternatives. Rancière's statement can be read as a call of arms, but to do what? Intervene more, with more of what Rancière calls politics and what others might call the political? Well, this is evidently not enough. We've seen that for Rancière, state institutions and popular demonstration are not two competing spheres, politics or police, political or politics. Democracy as a manifestation of equality and democracy as sovereign regime are intricately implicated in one another. They are co-constitutive. Furthermore, given the way Rancière's reading of politics and police is sometimes seen to map onto the reading of politics and the political, it makes me wonder if perhaps our over-reading of the distinction between these, the over-separation, as I call it, into the ontic and the ontological, is also something we need to be cautious of. Has it enacted a false separation between popular action and the state that has led us to take our eye off state institutions? Returning to Ricoeur's famous argument about the paradox of the political, he emphasises that these are two sides of the same problem. And it's really clear that this is the same problem, and it's not one thing we can just focus on one side without focusing on the other. However, in the same text, his approach is perhaps overly critical about the power side of things, what Rancière calls the police. Ricoeur wants to note the evils of political power, but in doing so, he casts all political power, all political organisation, I suggest, inadvertently, as evil, or at least is sometimes read in this way. Adding to a problem raised in recent work by Victoria Hugel, a former student here at Brighton, who is now based at Heidelberg, that by blurring any form of authority with authoritarianism, we've perhaps too quickly thrown the democratic baby out with the bathwater and failed to protect our democratic institutions. Indeed, regardless of how democratic institutions are, the popular sovereignty enacted by the crowd or an individual will always interact with the institutions of a regime, whether they're really democratic or not very democratic at all. They will always be interacting with that regime. And although institutions cannot take away one's capacity to enact equality, and it's really important to protect that, I'm not saying if we don't live in a democracy, we can't act democratically. I'm just saying that we have to remember, and I think it's really easy to forget this, that if we don't have democratic institutions, it can make the cost of democratic action far more punitive. And of course, if we're ever apt to forget this, we have multiple examples from around the world today, in Iran, in Myanmar, most recently, for example, but also we are fighting at the moment in the UK more and more restrictions on rights to protest. But still, we've got a scale, a grade here of difference of how risky it is to protest. And this is something we need to both be aware of, but we also need to be looking at institutional reform. Rather than simply critiquing and protesting more, we need to start asking questions about the institutional reform that needs to happen before it's too late. Every gradation of violence, therefore, needs to be noted and accounted for, but responded to with policy as well as political action. Thus, to conclude, or to get towards my conclusion, my concern that today's perhaps rather too hasty focus in our theorising on what is more commonly called the political, understood as the way we kind of live together, assemble together, organise together, and in today's workshop, how we write and read together, important though it is, and I am no way wanting to say it's not important, in post-foundational radical democratic theory has unfortunately come at the cost of ensuring we maintain the focus on the symbiotic twin sources of democracy, people's action and the state and institutions. Okay. Perhaps at times hubristic focus, can I say, on ourselves and the exciting democratic politics that we do, that we write, read, or dream of doing, writing or reading, rather than an urgent search to understand how this must always be accompanied by a focus on institutions, taking institutions seriously and working with them and through them as well as outside of them. In doing so, have we neglected to defend what I might simplistically call the good parts of the institutions of liberal democracy, which are currently crumbling very fast in front of our eyes? Does this also prevent us from seeing the radicalism of some policy, the potential for policy to effect revolutionary change in the weirdest and most unexpected ways? Take, for instance, the Beveridge Report that established the welfare state in the United Kingdom in the 1940s. Ushering in a period of state ownership and redistribution that is still responsible for the most financially equal society in the UK in the early 1970s than ever before or since, and a society that did launch many of the equality struggles that we continue to participate and develop in today, which is no mean feat, despite all of the many well-documented welfare states' ills that we still need to address. And this is something we are far away from being able to repeat today, despite the fact that we have, I think, much more widespread radicalism in academic thought today in UK universities. I'm not saying there's not a lot of conservatism as well, but there are some really strong networks of radical political thinking. But where's the associated policy? Where's the associated institutional thinking as well? Why are we so timid? And why do we give up that realm? Why do we not fight in that realm? Why is it that despite the much more widespread radicalism of academic thought today, and our theoretically grounded arguments for the primacy, if you like, of the political, whether you want to accept that language or not, that we're catastrophically failing to reverse institutionally the Tina doctrine that asserts the dominance of the market? We can carry on saying the political is primary today, but it's not, is it? In our lives, we keep being told the market is primary. We can't do this because the economy says no, it's not financially viable. It's increasingly noted that at least since the 1960s critique of authority, and in particular I'm thinking of the kind of Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze grouping, radical democratic theory has not known what to do about the state, other than critique it. But perhaps this critique of authority actually emerged from the history that has been traced already today by Oliver, in the 20th century emergence of the political as an autonomous sphere in response to the crises following the First and Second World War in Europe. But this autonomous sphere is riven always by the accompanying distinction between institutionalized power and change, and this is not without its price. I suggest this takes us to an impasse regarding the problem of the state that has all but relinquished the state to neoliberalism. If we do not want democracy to be relegated to the political, relegated, as I would suggest it is today, to protest and the social sphere, and increasingly marginalised, we need to remind ourselves that without defending politics, police forensia, the particularly democratic part of our democratic state, and without returning to theorise it, we will have no democratic institutions. And without democratic institutions, the democratic staging of the people is a lot more difficult and a lot more frightening. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm very pleased to see by the applause that we do still have some online participants. I was a little worried in our haste and tardiness that we hadn't checked. So thank you for still bearing with us. In keeping with the last session, I'd like to open the floor to any contributions online in the first instance, because I think it's a bit easier for us in the room to make our presence known. So are there any questions or comments on Claire's presentation from people who are joining us remotely? So we have Seraphine first. Oh, you are muted, Seraphine.
Thank you very much. Now my camera is working and now my microphone is working. So first of all, thank you for the great talk. I'm still trying to figure out the question as I start. I agree with your position that authority should not be equated with authoritarianism. But I would like to discuss a bit your criticism of the dichotomy of the political and politics. I understand your criticism of this heroic paradigm of the political event, but I think we can think of the event beyond this macho paradigm. And I think one way is Christoph Menke's recent theory of liberation. I mentioned Menke because I know you wrote about him in your book, Disorienting Democracy. Briefly, Menke's point is that authentic liberation must be a liberation from politics, basically, to use these terms. And why is that? For him, the horizon of all political intervention is Sittlichkeit, ethical life, morality, a certain habituation, because it's based in a certain form of life, to use the Wittgenstein term. And the problem with these kind of intervention is that they remain on the basis of this certain way of life, and they reproduce this way of life, because they are always about trying to fulfill the ideals of this shared Lebensform. For example, to try to be more humanist, or to be more just, or to be more fair, relative to a certain conception of Sittlichkeit. And so his approach is more to say liberation is a rupture with politics. And it's not so much this heroic moment, but more a failure to meet the requirements of a certain life form. And this failure opens then the possibility to tackle the problems on a political level, not on the politics level, but on a political level. And so I was just curious, because you're somewhat familiar with Menke, what do you think about this kind of eventual liberation approach that's not so much the heroic liberation?
Liam, is it okay for me to respond to Seraphin?
I think so. How long have you got, Claire?
I don't want to be rude. So let's say like 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, Alan.
I don't have anything else to do, so it's fine by me.
Yes,
I'm so
please,
sorry.
please do respond.
Okay, thank you. I'm so sorry as well. I hate this. It makes me feel like I'm kind of parachuting in and doing my paper and dashing out again, and that is what I'm doing. And I'm really, really sorry, because it's not very nice to have to do it. So apologies again. Seraphin, thank you ever so much for your question and thoughts as well, and your reflections on that. And I am really sad, because we had a workshop with Menke on his book. I think it was just after Christmas in January, and I don't think you were able to attend. I don't remember. I think you would have really enjoyed it. It was great fun, and I really enjoyed, but also found provocative, Menke's work, and we had a really interesting session. But to very briefly summarize some of my concerns about Menke's work on liberation, is I felt that in the end he ended up taking quite a universalizing approach, without really meaning to. And this, you know, in our conversation that we had that day, I think all of us as a group with Christoph found that we have many shared points, and we were trying to say kind of the same thing, but the different languages and different traditions we speak in were perhaps hindering us. And we felt in some ways that with Christoph's work, he was kind of stuck in this kind of dialectical world that was taking him more and more into this universalizing moment, that actually maybe, if I've got you right, the problem is, as you've kind of put it, that we need to, you said, to be authentic, we need to authentically kind of free ourselves from the politics or something. And I would say that just makes no sense to me. Okay, so okay, good, you're shaking your head, so perhaps I've misunderstood somewhat the language you were using, but my concern is that actually what we need is to be much more closely tied, perhaps than we have realized, to the institutions that we are critiquing. So not as to not critique them, but to ensure our critique hits home. And if we see ourselves constantly as these wonderful kind of virtuous radicals who are busy radically critiquing all of these state institutions, but not proposing alternatives and not seeking to retake the state, then what are we doing? Because the more we've done this, since we've been doing this, right, the more this type of critique has taken off, the worse neoliberalism is getting. And you could say, this has nothing to do with this. This is my arrogance, right? Thinking that political theorists could have any impact on the world at all. But if we have no impact whatsoever, what is the point? And the more we talk about this stuff, the worse the world is getting. So my concern is, it's not necessarily saying that this theorization, dividing the political from politics, is de facto wrong. It's saying the way we operate within this has led us to open up this wonderful free world of critique that's really exciting, where we can talk about the novel as political, where we can talk about all these different things, the family as political. But actually in doing that, we need to come back to that concern Roncier has, which is kind of nothing is political unless we're affecting politics. And if we're affecting politics, politics has to be acting on institutions. It can't just be happening in its separate space, in its void, in the street, you know. And the thing I think I've talked about quite a lot in my work that still captures me now is that image from, I think it was around 2010, when there were a lot of protests in the UK against the financial, kind of protests against the financial crash and precaritization of people. And there were a lot of unions got together, and they were marching in London, and they were marching around the financial district in London, and people were waving banknotes out of the window at them, you know, and saying, you can march all you like, you can be as radical as you like, you don't have any power. And we've got the power, we've got the money, get over it. So we actually, I just feel like there's a mismatch going on. We've got all this fantastic work and we need to tie it back. And we need to do that by countering and balancing it all the time with the application, and not getting too wrapped up in the ontologizing, the theorizing, and the kind of, you know, how do we understand the political as this pure moment? I really don't care. I want to know how it operates on politics, how it changes politics all the time. So I'm not sure I've completely responded to your question, because I think perhaps I'd certainly misunderstood it, but maybe I've given a bit more background to how I'm understanding this, and hopefully that helps to give a bit of an answer. Is that okay? But I'm happy to talk more at another time.
Thanks, Seraphin and Claire. Do we have anyone else online? Anyone in the? I can see hands in the room, so if there aren't hands online, and I'm sorry I didn't get an order, so can I maybe start here and then come to you second now?
Hi, Claire.
And loudly, please.
Hi, Claire. Thanks for that talk. I'm Owen, former alumni of the university. I kind of just wanted to contest a little bit first, maybe your general notion of the idea that we're losing democracy. In certain aspects, we certainly are. Yes, like the right to protest is being reduced, and lots of other aspects as well. But looking at the broader picture, you know, in the sense that every 5 years now we get to vote for however many of, you know, kind of, and now certainly post Corbyn, a bland mass of similarity as it was before. I did want to contest what you were saying a little bit, though, in the sense that I'm only saying this because recently I've read a bit of the French political theorist Bernard Manin, and he essentially argues that the forms of government that we mostly have in the West today, post the American, French and English bourgeois revolutions, is representative government. It's not democracy. Not democracy in the sense that certainly in the sense that there is any sense of representation for assembled people en masse in the form that you get in a protest. And so I just wondered if you could comment on that. And it also brought me back to thinking that, you know, the title of one of Rancière's major books is also Hatred of Democracy. So I wondered if you could, what your response would be to that.
Claire, do you mind if we take 2 questions and then you can respond to both of them, and then hopefully that will work a bit better with time. So,
hello, Claire, and thanks for the talk. First of all, I very much agree with you. I think it's a problem, which I will expand a bit on in my own presentation, with this ontologization of the political. But then some of the things that I've been thinking about myself, and I don't really have an answer to it, is whether we could think of what this distinction between the political and politics is trying to do by thinking in terms of form and content, or perhaps logics and that on which the logics are working or doing their whatever it is that they're doing. And I've been dealing with populism as well. And if we don't think that the people exist, that the people as a political actor, a political figure, can be filled with quite radically different contents, obviously there is some kind of distinction between form and content, and the logic of creating a people and that the specific way that people might be created in a certain So it's something I've been thinking about, trying to avoid the ontologization, but still maintaining some kind of distinction between something like form and content, logics, and concrete ideological, concrete demands, identities, or whatever.
Thank you for both the questions. They're both really interesting and really helpful questions. So I'm really kind of grateful because you're kind of forcing me to elaborate in different ways and to think about this more carefully. So with the first question, I really appreciate this question because this is exactly the kind of conversations I want to have, right? You know, what, if anything, is democratic about our institutions today? And I appreciate the argument you've made. And in my more pessimistic moments, I want to agree with you and go, yeah, it's crap. But actually, I think that's actually a really difficult position to take, because I think it overlooks and takes for granted a hell of a lot of rights and freedoms that we currently have within our current system. And if we say this is not democracy at all, then we're overlooking the influence of both equality and the liberal claims to rights that influence the establishment of so-called representative democracy, and which are trampled on every day in every instantiation of liberal democracy. But at least there's something there that we can use to hold up as a measure of its failure. Roncier's argument about the hatred of democracy is pointing out how so many Democrats today really hate the idea of democracy working properly. But he does make an argument, and around, I think, page 76, 77 of that book, that what we need, therefore, are stronger democratic institutions. And he's not asking for anything really like radical. He's talking about the fact that we need to be careful about funding and funding inequalities for parties in democratic elections. He's talking about the fact that we need to be careful of media intervention and the way in which the media can manipulate political arguments. These are really simple things that, when we think about political theory in a basic sort of, maybe I've just gone to study an undergraduate degree in political theory sense, we might consider part of democracy. And these are things now that I think it's really easy to go, oh, that doesn't even work. You know, that's just not going to work. And to be so pessimistic that we're giving up on something that was incredibly hard won. And that, you know, people fought and died for, and people are still fighting and dying for around the world, because a lot of people would be incredibly grateful for the system we have. So I think we have to be careful, and I don't think in any way you are being complacent in making that argument, but I think it could feed into a complacency of, rather than actually looking at the systems and institutions we have and fighting to make them good, we give up on institutions altogether and end up with nothing at all to protect us. So actually, I think perhaps we could look at other forms of representative democratic or direct democratic representation. But I think these are the arguments we want to be having and the discussions we want to be having alongside questions of how other ways of living can be political. So not to relinquish discussions about the political more widely, but alongside those discussions. So thank you ever so much for your question. Allan, I really would love to hear your talk this afternoon. And so, as I've said, Mark's recording it, and I will hopefully have a chance to listen into that, because it sounds like it would be really interesting and informative for me, and taking me down a potential way of doing, you know, a different way of doing the work I'm trying to do. One thing I would be cautious of, and I suppose I'd be curious to hear more about in your talk, is if we've got to distinguish form and content, do we need to do this any more than we currently have? Why do we need to do this? Haven't we got enough of this type of theory? Isn't the question now to bring together the form and content so that they can work in tandem to improve democratic institutions and democratic life more widely? So I suppose that's what I would be looking for in your talk this afternoon, how that helps this project of also reforming our institution. So I'm really keen to hear that, and hopefully once I've heard your talk, a recording of it, I might be able to send you some questions after your visit. So thank you ever so much, and I'll look out for that.
Thanks very much, Claire. I think in terms of time, we should probably, I don't know whether there's one more question, Mark?
It's from me, and Sam as well.
So, I mean, I was hoping we might finish fairly promptly, but can we just take 2 short questions and then maybe short answers, and then
I'll make mine not a question. I'll just make it a statement, but it would be a boring. Also, hi Claire. It would be a boring kind of technical clarification that would just be rude to contribute. Except I think it supports what you want to do, because I see you pivoting from the framework of the political that Oliver laid out so nicely, and you want to do something that's slightly orthogonal to that. And I think you can do that with Rancière better if you reject the idea that Rancière flops the political and politics, because I think that reading exists in the literature and it's wrong, because the political, as Oliver nicely laid out, I mean, we get this from Nancy and Le Coulibard. It then gets projected back on the 20th century thought, but we get it from them. So it is a distinction in French between la politique and le politique. And Rancière does not talk about le politique. He does not talk about it, except in about 3 different places where he speaks in English about the political, and it gets translated back into French. But Mes Ententes, the entire book, never mentions le politique. The 10 theses on politics are all 10 theses on la politique. So the distinction in Rancière is a different distinction entirely. It's police and politics. And then there's this thing that crops up in these couple of English pieces, and Jean-Philippe Duranty's work in English helped to frame the idea that there was the political. But I've tried to work through all the ways in which I think that won't work. And I think that what I've done there in clarifying that gives you the access to go off someplace else and to show that I think either coming at Rancière with politics and the political doesn't work, but also the idea of just flipping them. And it really won't work just terminologically to flip them, because then somehow police is politics and politics is not politics, it's something else. So I think you need to, I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that if you want Rancière to be your source, you're already in a better position to distance yourself a little bit more from politics, the political, which is where I saw the talk going anyway. So I'll leave that as a comment.
I feel you may want to respond to that, Claire, but let's go to Mark first.
My question is very, very similar, but so I won't repeat. But I couldn't help but feel, Claire, that the question you put to Oliver about did you need Sard, I could put to you about did you need Rancière? Because in fact, it strikes me that you're actually beginning to move away from the ways in which Rancière conceives the distinction between police and politics, and that you may end up in a position where you're forcing Rancière into a box that he's not quite comfortable in. So I wondered, given your previous work, if perhaps you're not actually on a path that's you'll end up somewhere else. Which echoes, I think, what Sam was suggesting.
Thank you. That was Sam, wasn't it? I thought they said Sam, and I thought it sounded like Sam, but I can't see Sam. Thank you, both of you, for your questions or interventions. Yeah, you know what? Part of me wants to just go, yeah, no, you're right. But actually, I don't think so, because when I started writing this paper yesterday for an hour, I started off with the idea of can I use Rancière to talk to this debate or not? Because otherwise I've got nothing to say. And actually, in doing so, it convinced me, sorry, that there is something to be said here, because Rancière is writing about the misreading of the political, and he is responding to that with his work. And so he's not in any way trying to pretend to put himself in someone else's box and use someone else's language. And Oliver, I think, is too hasty to just say you can map these on really quickly to each other. But I do think that Rancière is speaking within this tradition, which I think is problematic for Roskilde's work as well, right? Because then he ends up getting pushed into this funny position where he has to make a statement on whether he's a social democrat or not. And he goes, oh, no, I'm not a social democrat, I'm a radical democrat. And it all gets very awkward with people trying to define themselves and make political statements about who they are and where they belong. Because I think that debate about the political dominates so much post-foundationalist thought that whether or not Roskilde wants to be in that box or not, he is talking with those arguments and he is using that terminology. And the reason why he's chosen to call politics is to be on purpose, to be polemical and to use this term differently to that debate in order to show there are problems with that debate, but also to intervene in that debate. So I think, Sam, you're right. I don't want to be too quick, but I think there's a story to be told there on top of the work that you've done, Sam. Just to think about the way in which these Roskilde speaks to, but also speaks away from that debate, and then gives me ammunition that I want to make the wider argument I want to make. And that might also, I think, deal with a response to Mark. And I would say, for all his ills, I think using Roskilde is nowhere near as problematic as using Sard. And I think that one does need to make a statement if one is going to use such problematic literature, just to explain how one can still call themselves someone who is fighting for radical equality. I just think that would be useful sometimes to understand that. Anyway, moving on. Thank you very much, Mark and Sam, and everyone for engaging despite the difficulty of sound.
Well, thank you very much, Claire. And just to reassure you, for most of your presentation, we could hear you very audibly. So thanks again. If we could thank Claire again for her contribution. So I noticed that the schedule doesn't in fact have a break though.
I did the schedule thinking that Allan would probably want a beer later in the afternoon. The sooner he could get his presentation done, the better.
You know me so well.
Don't mind. Maybe take half a minute or 2 minutes to go to the toilets or whatever. But let's go straight in if that's okay.
So if we can be back in no later than 2:35. And then and that will give you time to set up Allan and we try and
I should have done this a long time.
Receiving emails from university thinking they should cancel them because they're worried.
They just now changed their mind.
I
just have to say, Mark, that enrages me on your behalf.
They've just sent me an email now. So they're considering. Last week when this, I wrote and I said, look, it may be
no, you told me
And I received an email from the saying you have to go.
I haven't thought of logging into the. I should, of course, because otherwise I cannot share my screen. I did some slides.
that would be fantastic.
But and I do have an
this is an intellectual project.
User on Brighton University, but I can't remember. So I hope to be able to change it. Yeah.
Sorry, that just enrages me.
I mean, the lecture's already compromised,
Yes.
because I've been told that it has to be written in such a way that a first-year undergraduate could understand. That's the proper story of the lecture.
And those are rules not to help the undergraduates understand it, but to help the senior administration.
Exactly.
Wow. Whether you can share your.
Oh, okay. So that's not necessarily.
I think there is sometimes a different status for guests. But let's see.
We'll see. Yes.
Yeah.
If you.
And it's.
I should immediately turn off my sound.
But I think you're asked the same question to the two sides. Of the
Slightly,
But you're
At least
talking
I'm
about
You
on.
have the
more
share
because I
button,
I have the share
so
button.
think now
hopefully that will work.
Oh, but I have. Oh yeah, I do.
Scholarly
I think
mentor.
at least
The
I
thing
have
is, she just
opened this one.
It's
Yes.
just an instinct to go wrong.
But
She
why
doesn't-
do
actually,
you
she
have
doesn't-
a window?
She's done with the
So,
what she's doing is working with institutions, and she doesn't need to be confused.
Why
and
can-
trying to show that somehow Ross is a couple of points.
Well, and in a way as a source, because she needs to be reading or specific
See,
literature,
because,
right?
you know,
Like she needs
this
to be reading
choice-
about housing policy.
Some
Here
here
she
are-
knows about. Yeah.
Really work in institutions being done by Esposito in
Let's see
the past 2 years. Is Roberto Esposito?
Oh, no.
I mean, from a different angle,
Yeah,
but
okay.
it's entirely for
No.
institutions.
Yeah.
This was exactly
You
my
can't
question.
choose the window if you click on
Ah.
that.
As an institutional
Sorry,
theory.
just
okay.
yeah.
I mean,
Exactly.
Ah no,
She
that wasn't the
does
one
everything
actually,
from the wrong.
because
But
oh yeah,
it
it
is. As
is.
an institutional
Yeah.
theory.
Only I
don't
would
know if
like
you have the
to
same
have my
feeling.
notes. I will just
To
sorry.
be honest, I think she's not going to critique
Because
it.
I think I pushed.
She's
I
saying
took
that
the wrong
it
one.
doesn't give us the
And
mechanisms
then
whereby
window.
we can think
And then I
through
think I
logical
should go
policy that
for
we actually run through
this one.
institutions.
Yeah.
Um,
But and it's not an invalid critique, but it's too weak a critique.
No.
Right, because and this is why it's because the framework that Oliver gave us, the body of literature that is on the political, none of it is institutions. Rancière, I think, is one of the figures who speaks to that literature.
This is remarkable.
Points to
Yes,
the
it is.
need.
I'm a great fan. I'm a great
He
fan.
doesn't do it.
I don't get
He
the
doesn't do it.
provision.
And he points to it in a way that
making
No. My
But-
son
yes, but she
studied
does.
and,
Exactly, that's right. So she just needs to go someplace else, right, to build up from
Yeah.
the ground at a different
Well,
set of
he
sources.
just studied university.
These are the sources she
And
knows.
she can stick to she can stick to in the sense that she says, look, Ronson says this, but he doesn't give us.
No.
Yeah, but that's like a,
that doesn't.
but that's like a paragraph,
That's
right? Yeah.
Do you want
Yeah,
me to
that's a paragraph, and then you
say,
say,
by way
like,
of
who does that?
introduction?
If you please, but I don't.
So I would say that you work in Roskilde
Yeah.
University, and that your recent work is on political populism.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah. That's basically it. I've been working with Ernesto's discourse theory for way back.
I'm afraid that's I wouldn't be able to.
No.
pull
But
that out of the lineup.
no.
Yeah.
But it's really sad that Oliver isn't here because we've been discussing these things for so long. So I guess this is
Yeah, I think it is directional, so that would be great.
yeah. Oh, at least I'm on some screen.
Yeah.
No, I can't.
I like her. I think her views from and I mean whatever.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's what they want.
Oh, yeah, the people are gonna show up to it.
Or that I will say something.
Oh, of course,
In a public
yes.
forum where they can't interrupt. Because there is no possible way in which any of them can interrupt
Right.
that arena.
Is this about the cuts of the university? Where and when are you giving this?
I'm giving the, so it should, 3 years in the very close to us. But there's all that Brighton is an institution of doing an election. Be delayed until tomorrow. But they announced the redundancy last Thursday. So now, of course, a lot of staff are really upset. It's 100. And some people are withdrawing. They refuse to go to any university. But they're also worried some people want to do just right. Because so anyway, it's just one of these really stupid institutional.
Oh, you're still
That might be useful.
I think we're probably. good to go. Actually, I think that's everyone back. So thank you for enduring, and I will have a word with Mark about scheduling. But we have our last speaker for today. Allan Hansen works at Roskilde University in Denmark, and his recent work has been on populist politics. He's just finished a large project on that topic, and today I'll let him introduce his talk.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And you did a great job in, displacing me all around the schedule time-wise. So this is really a hauntological experience, actually. Time is really out of joint for me right now. I know that I won't be able to go through all the things that I would like to say. So I think I should start by making my basic claim. And it is that in contrast to what Oliver is arguing, I think that we should leave ontology behind. And my basic argument is that ontology is a way of stating the being of beings. But I think that with post-structuralism, we are beyond giving the possibility of determining in a positive way the being of beings. So what we have left is what Derrida would call the play of impossibilities, that we know that whatever form or content a being will take, it will always be to move ahead, haunted by an impossibility. And I think we are better suited with skipping the concept or the word ontological, and instead pick up on the neologism that Derrida introduced in Spectres of Marx, and talk about hauntology instead, in order to make this point clear from the start. And the second thing, as means of introduction, is that I've been working on populism for quite some years, and the funny thing, and it was relatively late I realized it, but there are so many mainstream discussions about populism that opens with a sentence from the Communist Manifesto, paraphrasing it. So instead of the spectre of communism, it's the spectre of populism. But it's really rarely used for anything. It's just like a paraphrase that just stands there, and then people move on. And I thought, this can be used for something, and I remembered Derrida's deconstruction. And the more I thought about it, the more I think it works. So, and the third thing was that since the more overall theme for this nice meeting was novels, I tried to find some references from the literary world, and I won't go through them, but I've mentioned some of them here. On the first slide. I will return, I hope, to a very nice theatre, a very nice place that I saw a few days ago. It's been up in London, I know. I don't know if you've heard about it. But of course, obviously, Shakespeare's Hamlet is also a reference in Derrida, with the time being out of joint. It's a Hamlet. But also I came to Dickens' A Christmas Carol, where there is ghost of Christmas past, ghost of Christmas present, and interestingly, the ghost of Christmas yet to come. And those of you who know Derrida's work would know that this idea of to come is actually quite central. So, but Derrida, to the best of my knowledge, never discusses Dickens' work. But yeah, so much for the literary references. It's not my, I don't know very much about it. So we'll move on. Okay, Can I? I cannot. Oh, this is. I have no clue.
If you,
Thank you so much. So, in discourse theory, there is this idea of radical negativity, and it's also applied in the idea of the conditions of possibility and conditions of impossibility, which is something that I endorse very much, to try to think through effects of radical negativity. Famously, Clare has this. He has a section in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, which is called Beyond the Positivity of the Social. So the idea is that we move beyond the positive determination of what society is all about, to think radical negativity. But as you presumably know, in that book, and Oliver sticks to this, the radical negativity is thought of in the form of antagonism. So, Clare says very explicitly in that book that antagonism is the limit of objectivity. It is the point where the floating of differences come to a halt, and where negativity acquires a presence as such in the social field, even if, and I'm not quite sure to interpret that actually, but he refers back to Wittgenstein and said that it can be shown, it cannot be said. I have an idea what he's thinking about, but I'm not completely sure what that distinction means. We don't need to dig into that. But the main thing is that, as I read it, the idea is that we can actually experience negativity as such in the social field whenever there is an antagonism. And that is what later on the idea of the ontological primacy of the political is based on. This actually changes in New Reflections of the Revolution of Our Time, where he introduces the notion of dislocation. And commenting on that, he says that antagonism is already a discursive articulation. It is to articulate the other as the source of our grievances and as our enemy. And therefore, dislocation is more basic in inverted commas, as base superstructure is not really doing the trick here. But anyway, I agree. Oliver strongly disagrees, as you can read in his book on thinking antagonism. So my claim is that radical negativity cannot be observed directly. It cannot gain presence. We will never be beyond the movement of significations, the floating of differences, and so on. So, for example, difference is, of course, in some sense negative, something that the one thing is not, but it will always be experienced as difference between two positive instances. So it's only, we can experience the positive instance and we can point out there's a difference between them, but the difference as negativity cannot be experienced as such. It'll always have to go the way through some kind of positive experience. And this is where post-structuralism comes in, because, as you presumably know, to structuralism, because there is the idea of thinking the totality, we can actually, we can positivize all the differences in a given language, so we know what it means, or the signification is it. To post-structuralism, the negative difference haunts the positive instance. So because signification is based on difference, it will never be full. It will never be completely stable. It won't be, full or as such. And to me, this is what I read into Derrida's notion of hauntology, that we can experience negativity in disturbances, in distances to what would have been their full presence. But because of this distance to the what would have been their full present is I don't know how to say this in English, is eternal, it cannot be overcome, then we are faced what I would call general hauntology. Our social world is a haunted space, so to say. Yeah, I think I skipped that one. Oh, I have to, no, I can read here. So, and actually, I think that Laclau made an excellent review of Derrida's Spectres of Marx, where he introduces, or not only introduces, but seemed to accept this idea of hauntology. We don't have to read through it all, but constitutively, time is out of joint, as Hamlet says. So we have a constitutive anachronism at the root of any identity. No identity is able to achieve a full presence. It's always haunted. But then he says, Marx, however, attempted the critique of the hauntological from the perspective of an ontology. That is, the arrival at a time that is no longer out of joint, the realization of a society fully reconciled with itself to a purely ontological society. And I think this is correct. The idea of communism in classical Marxism fulfill this role of repositivation what have been effects of negativity during class societies. But still, Laclau maintained the ontology as the basic category, and as you know, he says that the political has ontology priority. And to example, he said then things on populist reason. He talks about the ontological need to express social division was stronger than its ontic attachment to a left-wing discourse. It was part of what I was asking Clare about for early on. But to me, there is no such thing as an ontological need. There is no positive being that produces needs that will be met in social action. So even to express social division is an articulation. It's a way of dealing with negativity that cannot be taken for granted. There are so many other ways that we can imagine people dealing with grievances, things like that. And so to me, this is general hauntology. Yeah, as I said many times. And perhaps to go a little bit more into what hauntology is, but when did I start?
I think you've been talking slightly less than quarter of an hour.
Okay, so like 5-10 minutes more. Okay, so one way of thinking about the logic of spectrality, and I'll return to the headline there, is in terms of inheritance. And our first presentation today also touched about the inheritance. And this is one of the things that Derrida is discussing in Spectres of Marx. What does it mean to see oneself as an inheritance of Marx? And obviously, as there are so many different interpretations, and Derrida thinks of himself as an heir of Marx, but he wouldn't accept the thesis of the determination in the last instance by the economy. I consider myself to be an heir of Laclau, but I don't believe in the ontological primacy of the political. So there's always an interpretation, there's always an articulation involved in inheriting something. We try to incarnate their spirits, but we are re-articulating it for the simple reason that there is no such thing as a pure spirit of Marx Leclerc or whoever it could be. So such rearticulation or incarnation contaminates, or it haunts, it disturbs both the absent spirit, which is not there. There is no such thing as a pure Marxist spirit or pure Laclauian position, but it also contaminates the bodies incarnating it, claiming to be the representative of this spirit that we are inheriting. And this is actually, it's a great play. I don't know, I knew it's been up in London. It's called Inheritance. It's by Matthew Lopez. It's like 7 or 8 hours. So it's about the AIDS epidemic in New York. And this is a Danish word for inheritance. And what you presumably cannot see, but I tell you, it's the AIDS molecule or virus or whatever it's called that's been. So this is, to me, and another picture for that. I think they did a great job. This is representing all of those New York from the homosexual part. New York. It's representing all that died. They were invited to go to a house in the play, and they are and died in that house. And this play I think plays very fine on this doubleness in inheritance, inheriting their heroic spirit, fighting AIDS, not knowing what it was, and things like that, but also this very obvious haunting that's involved in being haunted by something like AIDS. So if you ever get the chance, do go and see it. It's very good. So yeah, perhaps I can actually sort of round up here, because just to round up. So why do I not think that hauntology can be articulated with the idea of the primacy of the political? I will. This is a quote from Leclerc's review of Derrida, where he says, "Since hauntology is inherent to politics," with that I completely agree, "the transcendence of the split between being and appearance will mean the end of politics." I mean, a full presence, full being, fully constituted being will mean the end of politics. If, however, as the deconstructive reading shows, ontology, full reconciliation, is not achievable, time is constitutively out of joint, and the ghost is the condition of the possibility of any present, politics too becomes constitutive of the social link. And to me, this is one step too far, because it's one thing to say that there would not be politics if there was not hauntology. With that, I completely agree. It is something quite different to say that politics equals hauntology, which is what he says towards the last part of the quote. So to me, politics, the potentiality of politics, or the political, if we want to speak in these terms, is conditioned upon hauntology, but it doesn't follow from hauntology. There is an articulatory step that needs to come in between the experience of hauntology and articulating that experience in political terms, which is, yeah. So this has a lot of consequences for Laclauian discourse theory. I won't go into that, but I'll be happy to discuss them with you. I won't claim to have thought it through. There's lots of things I am thinking about myself, but this is the basic of my argument. And as I said, it's very much, it's very different from the path that Oliver is taking. I will end with this. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see who that ghost is?
Looks a little like you.
It is actually me. It was taken by Jason in an art exhibition through some kind of plastic screen or something like that. But since I look like a ghost, I thought it was very... Yeah, no, I'll end here, and thank you for listening. We hope so.
I think that I've just realised that in the room we can see the room, but I suspect that online you can just see Mark.
And a very dark, ghostly presence of the two of us, actually.
so I do apologise. We've tried to bring Alan's camera up, but as he's pointed out, you can't really see him.
It's
except in silhouette. So
yeah,
that and Alan gracefully has said that that's on brand for the theme of his talk. So I don't know whether any of the online participants would like to kick off the questions. We can certainly take questions in the room if not, but if anyone would like to ask a question from our wider audience, if you can raise your hand, then I can call on you. So I'm going to open it up to the room, but please do feel free to come in to the meeting if you have a question as we go on. Stefanos. Sorry, okay. Spiros. Apologies.
From the same. Thanks, Allan. Very nice topic. Only to mention that my last book in Greek is entitled Spectres of Derrida and Democracy to Come. So close to my intellectual interest this period of time. At the end of your speech, you were talking about this critical articulator link, which is, let's say, the most interesting part of your talk here, because at the end of the day, when it comes to the critical relationship between politics and ontology, we need this critical articulator link in order to make politics in a real sense. Otherwise, I think that we have this problem that comes actually from Derrida. I'm talking about his idea about aporia, okay, which is the phenomenon of antecedability that at the end of the day leads us in a condition that Baudrillard defines as inertia. I don't know if you have any idea about this, which is a condition of stillness and immobility. The whole thing for me is not about ontology and podology, but the way you can make a distinction between ontologia positiva and ontologia negativa, between positive ontology and negative ontology. I think that the way you understand ontology is whatever I define as theologia, ontologia or theologia, even negativa, negative ontology. What is it exactly in terms of Derrida? If Derrida seeks a way to make possible the impossible, okay, at the end of the day, the problem is that we can't make this, okay, and the problem is turned into a kind of undecidability or impasse or no way out. We can't find actually this critical articulator link that you see there. And in that sense, he speaks about the democracy to come. Democracy comes, okay, all the time, but at the end of the day, she is not there. She remains a ghost. We can't touch them, okay, in any way. So there's a critical problem here that we can't think about it. We can't name, okay, can't give a name to the unthinkable. This reminds me Lacan sometimes, or Freud, in that sense that we try to give all God, which is the problem in political theology. We try to give a name, okay, to the unthinkable, which is being, okay, but at the end of the day, we can't do it. So it approaches us in a sense, okay, we are stretching our hands in order to touch it, but we can't do it. This is negative ontology or democracy to come. So what is this articulatory link for you? Okay? It's very interesting because without it, let's say that it's the key. We need to unlock, okay, the negative ontology, to give a name to that thing that it hasn't a name at first hand or to the unthinkable. What is this exactly? You have to realize it. Allan,
Sure.
To give it a real sense in order to touch it, to keep it in our hands. It's very critical.
It is. Yeah, I'll just answer this one.
I think so.
Yeah. Yes, it is very critical, and I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I'm not able to completely answer your questions, but I think there are. So the point is that I think that negative ontology is at least in danger of, through this naming, positivizing that which cannot be positivized. So I'd be more comfortable in trying to think impossibility rather than just, in quotation mark, impossibility or the negative. So this would be the first part of the answer. And because it is always something haunting, something that is actually positivized, that which I think can work as the articulatory link is our tradition, so to say. It's because this doesn't mean that there is nothing there, so to say. It just means that whatever is there is always incomplete, never fully present, and things like that. So my argument is that it is possible to articulate grievances, injustices, and things like that in a political and in a democratic way. There's just no guarantee that it will happen. And I think that to say that the political has ontological primacy at least runs the danger of fooling oneself into believing that it will happen by itself. Yeah. So this is and the second
kind of ontological autism, for example.
Yeah, for example, yeah.
So I saw Mark's hand first, then I think Seraphim, and then Chris. So shall we take Mark? If you want to ask your question, we'll see where we are, and Allan, you can see if you want to respond one by one.
Allan, I have lots of questions, but I'll try and be precise. The first question, overdetermination. I can't help but wonder if the ontological is an escape from overdetermination. In other words, if the turn to the ontological makes the ontological into the place of what the economy had in Althusser. I know this is a critique Zizek has made, but I'm not sure that you need contingency to become ontological, because you can talk about overdetermination and contingency in relation to a range of different discursive practices. So that's just which I think is where your logic goes, which would mean perhaps a return to overdetermination as well, if one wants to think about social orders. Second, I have for a long time thought that the logic of identification is a mistake. And I think it's a mistake because it's kind of it's the activist's mistake. It's what the Leninist assumes about politics, that people strongly identify with the empty signifier, with socialism, with whatever. But in fact, most politics takes place without strong forms of identification. People are articulated in terms of identities they already have. And it's the ways in which those identities are slightly shifted, slightly remade, rendered slightly, taken to a place they weren't perhaps at prior to that. But it's very rare to find radical forms of identification, unless you're in the bloody SWP. So for me, I think the left has the hegemonic left has misunderstood the nature of what Gramsci termed hegemony. Because hegemony doesn't rely on identification in that sense. So I think you can link the critique of ontology to a critique of identification at the same time, which then allows us to think politics more pragmatically.
Were there more questions? Or?
There are, but you can choose if you would like to take a barrage.
No,
no.
I've completely lost track of time, which is very fitting given
I think
the topic
we've got
of
another quarter of an hour. So
great. No, yeah, I know you have this thing with identification, Mark. I wouldn't be as antagonistic towards it as you are. I think I would say that overdetermination would be, I presume, conditioned by something like Hauntology. I mean, we can talk about different words for it, but it would be conditioned of something like Hauntology, because there can only be overdetermination if there's no full present or a full. And then when it comes to identity, I think, in a sense, I can understand. I think I understand what you mean, that the way politics normally takes place is not that we shout out, identify as citizen or something like that. We say this, it's unjust that the factory is placed or shut down or whatever it is. But I think that when you then look into it, there is still a moment of identification involved in the very to have an identity that is able to politicize the placing of a factory demands some kind of identification with something, and it's exactly identification because it is not there.
This depends how you read identification. You can't read it in the sense in which Freud reads it.
Who?
The logic that Freud puts forward in terms of identification requires taking us all the way back to much earlier forms of identification that are formative of identity. Those radical breaks don't happen much later in life. The logic doesn't work.
Okay, I don't know. I would put it in the sense that I think Ernesto said it quite nicely. That's the way I think about it anyway, that we need to identify with something because our identities are not full.
This is the same logic you just offered.
No, well, no.
Sorry, I'll leave it.
Serafin, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Thank you. Yes, thank you for your talk. In a way, my statement or my question ties in with one of the previous questions. Your basic claim was that in contrast to this post-fundamentalism Oliver proposed, we should leave ontology behind, basically. And as far as I understood him, Oliver's use of ontology is not so much a way of stating the being of beings. That would be what he would call a fundamentalist understanding of ontology. To return to the literary theme of the workshop, Oliver is not talking about, to quote Goethe's Faust, what holds the innermost world together. Rather, he understands ontology in the sense of a Heideggerian, der Grund gründet als Abgrund. The ground grounds as an abyss. And this paradoxical theoretical gesture can also be found in Derrida. For example, like we heard in Aporias, where he speaks of the possibility as impossibility. Now, one could argue that the post-fundamentalist notion of the political is trying to reach exactly this dimension. So I would say that the notion of the political is not so far away from hauntology, especially because politics, as Oliver understands it, is more about the possibility and the possibility of possible actions, and not about this possibility of impossibility. So rather than abandoning ontology and the political, I would argue that hauntology is extremely important for understanding this ontological dimension of the political, and focusing on this ontic dimension of politics runs the risk of overlooking those specters because it focuses so much on the possible as such and not on the impossibility.
Yeah, I like the way you said post fundamentalism, and so, and it's sad that Oliver is not here to hear that. I think he would have preferred foundationalism, but anyway, I agree with very much with Oliver up to the point where he equates the abyss thinking with antagonism. I simply think that sometimes I think he's very close to completely voiding, can you say that? You know, emptying antagonism of all possible content, but then he still uses it to make a necessary link to the political, which is again in his latest writing not quite easy to understand, to me at least, what he means with. But I would be my disagreement with him would be whether antagonism is a good name for this logic of post-foundationalism, and I don't think it is, basically, and that's why. And I think we can determine our concepts as we please, but I really think that there are some linguistic logics in this hauntology that makes it much more difficult to play some of the language games that I think is a mistake to play when we talk about the ontology of the political and things like that. It doesn't make sense to talk about a hauntological need of expressing something with Laclau's quote from earlier on. So this is where my disagreement with Oliver is.
Thanks. Chris.
I think that part of what Derrida is doing with hauntology and the impossible is to encourage us into a negotiation with a quite radical sense of otherness or alterity as part of our political lives and political ideas. So I'd be interested to know what you think that does to the categories or the theories of radical politics or radical democracy. You didn't really mention that dimension of the idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. No, I completely agree. And again, I'm not completely certain what I think about these things, because to some extent, I think that that Derrida's ideas of politics is, like Oliver said earlier, too much in the ethical register, you might say. That it's very much directed towards, the openness toward the event, that you cannot really know what a ghost wants from you, and therefore you have to keep open. You cannot know the ghost and things like that. And in some sense, I think this is a very nice ethics for us post-modern or post-foundationalist beings. But I also think that no politics really can be. I mean, it might be a very rude reading, but as I would think about it in terms of tolerance, right? That you have to be very tolerant towards the other, because you can never the otherness should be accepted. But when it comes to politics, well, you need to draw lines and there's conflicts. There are things that I would tolerate and there are things I would not tolerate. And I don't believe that we can turn the world into a better place to be without struggle, without use of power and things like that. So, and I think that that dimension tends to disappear quite a lot from Derrida. I then think that sometimes when I read at least Chantal's later work and also many of the things that Laclau has been arguing, there's perhaps too little openness towards the other, too little and too much focusing on constructing identities that can carry out a power struggle. And I'm not sure what to think about it, but potentially I think that Derrida's notion of democracy to come is really too heavy an ethicalization of democracy, that I think that I would prefer his justice to come, so to say, and to say, well, when we move into to democracy, we are moving into the political realm, and it's a matter of instituting an order, and we will need to, if not leave ethics behind, we will at least need to think much more politically strategic in order to further democracy. Yeah.
But he says it, Allan. He says that the construction is justice.
Yeah. Justice, but not.
Clear.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
And as far as your question, Chris, that it comes from his Levinasian heritage. Okay. It's about the opening to exteriority, which is the spectrality of the ontology. The absolute otherness, the radical otherness, and so on and so forth. It's exactly the ethical part of his analysis that at the end of the day turns into politics in Derrida. Okay. What is this exteriority in politics? Which is your question. What is this exteriority, the other, the radical otherness in politics? This is no question, Allan.
A question to me, what it is?
You said earlier, okay, what is this? When it comes to politics, in ethical terms, is the other, okay? Okay, this exteriority, the radical otherness. In politics, what is this? The other ontology, the other party. What's exactly? This is my question here.
Yeah, no, I think that in politics it will be positivized, so to say. It's always actual opponents that we're confronting, and we're never confronting authority as such. To me, this it's probably too rude a distinction, but to me, this is the ethical way of thinking, whereas political way of thinking is always confronting something that is actually there, and we're fighting against. Yeah.
So the first one is abstract, and the second one is
could be actual or concrete or something like that.
So I think we have time for one more question. So, time, Sam.
Just footnote, and I don't want to speak for you, at least misspeak for you, Alan, so if I get this, if you don't buy this, then correct me. But the distinction there for me is that deconstruction is justice is a Derridian claim that I don't think requires the Levinasian ethical framework. In the way that so much of his more Levinasian writings and the insistence on democracy to come and openness to the other seems to implement that framework in a more ontological way. So I accepted your distinction in the set, but I think there is a difference there between that and deconstruction. My question was about the status of ontology, and I think what I would like to add is the question of a we has been invoked quite often, and I don't want to ask who's in the we, I want to ask who the we is. That is, who is speaking and what is the work that is being done? Because for me, Oliver gave us an argument for the necessity of what I think he called ontology. But he used the language repeatedly of ontological claims. And he made a great critique of empiricism and social science work of if they want to say something about this, they either have to presuppose an ontology or make their empiricist epistemology the lied ontology, but that there is a necessity to ontological implications and ontological claims. And I buy that. You started off with what's limiting about the project of the being of beings. Seraphin then moved that, and I'd call that early Heidegger, and then Seraphin then moved us to later Heidegger, where it's a question of being, but it has to be broken apart from the ontological difference. For me, the difference is that Heideggerian project, which also in many ways is a Derridian project and is at times a Claudian project, is the we that is speaking is the philosopher who is philosophizing. So I see a difference between ontologizing as a mode of political theory, and many do this. Some of my closest colleagues do this. They construct an ontology of the world. They describe the world as marked by precarity or climate change conditions, and their ontology implies a political theory. This could be one way of thinking of Heidegger's fundamental ontology. This could be one way of criticizing a certain ethical strand in Derrida. That, I think, is distinct from, say, going back to Clare's project, where she's moving toward let's theorize institutions, let's look at them on the ground. One can do a mode of inquiry that is an analysis of the world. Say, in my work, it's often a critique of capitalism. Here's what it looks like, here's what we engage with it. In Clare's project, would be specific institutions that can be democratizing. I would want to agree with Oliver that along the way, we must sometimes make ontological claims and even do ontological analysis. So the distinction is now ontology pro or con. It's ontology. Is it a limited tool within a project that is not itself a fundamental ontology? And thus, if one has allegiances to this project of political theory, which Clare articulated and I sometimes do, it's a matter of saying one of the tools the political theorist takes up is an ontological tool. Like at this moment, we will analyze this ontologically, as opposed to thinking that we will derive a politics or a theory of society or a theory of economy from our grand philosophical project. And I think, Derrida is such a key figure here because the deconstruction of the history of Western metaphysics is both the most anti-philosophical project and yet in the mode that Derrida prosecutes it, often very much a universalizing philosophical project. Like we can go back to the debate between Derrida and Foucault, where what seems to be at stake is an attendant commitment to the world historically and a kind of attempt to formally theorize at larger levels. So I wonder, to make this a more specific question, because I'm rambled, I'm sorry, but I was trying to pull some threads together. How would you see the difference between what Oliver specifically argued for as we must make ontological claims and your argument at the beginning of the project isn't to study the being of beings, and does it help you to think about that as describing what the mode of inquiry is, that what we're doing here is a thing that is not the same as ontology, even if the thing we're doing sometimes involves ontological arguments?
Good questions. I think that I really think that displacing the terminology towards hauntology helps here. That you can say that when we are on that, I don't know if it's a level, but the question, what used to be the positive question of beings, I think to think about it in terms of hauntology, of something that is hit by an impasse or negativity and things like that, is a productive way of thinking about it, this possibility, impossibility, dialectics. But then I also completely agree that thinking about whatever it is we're thinking about, working about it, an ontological question is a rewarding way of going about thinking about it. And I don't know if this is a general, but at least Leclau argues that the ontological question is the question, how does the world have to be in order for this to be possible, and things like that. And I don't know if you can talk about I don't know. I was going to say middle range, but obviously it's not middle range. But to me, power, articulation, exclusion in the social world are ontological in that sense. That there cannot be social relations that are not exclusionary, that are not based on power, and that do not have an articulatory side to it, so to say. But yeah, but that is only possible because the basic, the hauntological overall picture is, yeah. So I don't know if this is, but I completely accept the idea that it's fruitful and it's necessary in theorizing about things to ask something that ontological questions to it and see what we come up with. Where I don't, yeah, where I'm critical of Oliver's project is to say that we end up with antagonism or something like that, and therefore all we know that all social beings have a political history or are political, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If we can show our appreciation again, that'd be great. So just to remind people in the room that we get to go again tomorrow, starting hopefully promptly at 9:30. I think the first paper is in fact at 9:30. Is that right, Mark? So I hope we'll see some of the people in the room and people online, and thanks especially to people who've joined us remotely. And shall I close the meeting now, Mark?
Yeah, I think we're done. We started 9:30. I mean, there may be slight delays just for getting things set up. We had problems with people registering this morning, so we've got the same problem. But yeah, great. No, sorry, we're in a different room tomorrow for those colleagues who are here. We're next door in Edward Street.